The afternoon of April 10th, 1834, started like any other spring day in New Orleans' French Quarter. The air was heavy with humidity and filled with the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms. But then smoke began pouring from the windows of the elegant mansion at 1140 Royal Street, and neighbors rushed over, thinking they were about to help a family in distress. What they found instead would completely shatter their understanding of evil itself. When firefighters smashed through the doors and raced upstairs, they weren't prepared for what they were about to see. They expected to find furniture and belongings, but instead they found human beings. 7 enslaved people were chained to the attic walls, their bodies showing the marks of unspeakable cruelty. Some were hanging from spiked iron collars, others had their limbs stretched and torn apart, and a few were missing body parts entirely. And the person behind this chamber of horrors wasn't some mysterious stranger lurking in the shadows. It was Madame Delphine LaLaurie, a respected socialite, a charitable church member, and a celebrated figure of New Orleans high society. For years she had hidden her true nature behind silk gowns and glittering dinner parties, while secretly torturing human beings in her own home. This is the story of how one woman's evil thrived in plain sight, shielded by wealth, privilege, and a society that chose to look away from the suffering of the enslaved. Marie Delphine McCarty was born around 1787 in New Orleans, a city that was then a melting pot of cultures, languages, and contradictions. Her father, Bartholomew Lewis McCarty, was an Irishman who had built his place in Louisiana society, while her mother, Marie Jeanne Label, came from a well-connected Creole family. Growing up in the Spanish colonial period, young Delphine lived in a world where enslaving human beings wasn't just legal, it was expected of families with her social standing. The McCarty family was firmly rooted in New Orleans society, and from the start, Delphine was destined for a life of privilege and influence. But with privilege in early 19th century New Orleans came a terrible kind of power, the power of life and death over enslaved people. And for Delphine, that power became an addiction more dangerous than any drug. The New Orleans of her youth was unlike anywhere else in America. French, Spanish, and American influences blended together, creating a cultural world where Creole society had its own rules and traditions. Families like the McCartys moved in elite circles, attending glamorous balls, throwing elegant dinners, and carefully arranging marriages to strengthen their social standing. Girls of Delphine's class were educated in the arts of refinement, speaking French, playing music, dancing, and learning how to run a household. But running a household in New Orleans also meant controlling enslaved people. From a young age, Delphine was taught to see enslaved people not as human beings, but as property. That early conditioning shaped the woman she became. In a society that normalized ownership of people, cruelty could grow unnoticed, until it grew into something monstrous. At just 19 years old, Delphine married for the first time. Her husband was Don Ramón de López y Angulo, a Spanish officer stationed in New Orleans. Like most Creole marriages, it was less about love and more about cementing family power and wealth. Don Ramón was much older than his teenage bride, and the marriage was more of a social contract than a romance. Their union didn't last long. He died in 1804, leaving Delphine a widow at only 21. Instead of devastating her, the loss awakened something in her. For the first time, she held real control over money, over property, and most importantly, over the enslaved people in her household. Records from this time are limited, but whispers later suggested she was already showing signs of cruelty. Neighbors noticed that her servants seemed unusually fearful, and rumors spread about how harsh she could be. Even during this first marriage, in 1808, she married again, this time to Jean Blanc, a wealthy banker and influential politician. With him, Delphine had 4 children, and on the surface she fit perfectly into her role as a Creole wife and mother. But behind that picture-perfect facade, the darkness inside her was growing. Servants began disappearing, and those who remained carried unexplained injuries that couldn't be brushed off as normal household discipline. When Blanc died in 1816, Delphine was once again widowed, but this time she was wealthy, powerful, and had full command over a large household of enslaved people. And with each rise in power, her cruelty escalated. The more freedom she gained, the more vicious she became. It was as if the deaths of her husbands removed any restraint she might have had, letting her true nature spill out unchecked. Her third and final marriage came in 1825, when she wed Dr. LaLaurie, a younger man who seemed perfectly content to let her manage the household. This marriage wasn't about love either. It was about convenience. His role as a respected physician gave Delphine the perfect cover for her crimes. His medical background may have even influenced the increasingly calculated nature of her cruelty. The doctor's reputation provided explanations for the screams that echoed from the mansion and the strange odors that drifted out from behind its walls. And their grand home on Royal Street became not just a display of wealth, but the center of unimaginable horror. The mansion was a symbol of privilege, 3 stories tall, filled with imported furniture, sparkling chandeliers, and elegant art. On the outside, it reflected refinement and grace. But hidden inside were spaces transformed into torture chambers. The attic, the basement, and several rooms were equipped for unimaginable cruelty. Here, away from the eyes of society, Delphine indulged her darkest impulses. Enslaved people in the household lived in constant terror. Survivors later told of her delight in devising elaborate punishments, turning everyday human beings into objects of her twisted experiments. Her methods weren't random. They were cold, systematic, and carefully recorded, almost as though she saw herself running experiments in suffering. The medical knowledge from her husband's profession likely played a role in the grotesque procedures she inflicted, always keeping victims alive so the torment could continue. What made her especially dangerous wasn't only her cruelty, but her ability to conceal it behind an image of grace and respectability. To society, she was the model of Southern womanhood, charming, devout, and generous. She donated to charities, hosted elegant events, and cultivated friendships with the city's elite. When screams came from the mansion, they were brushed off as strict discipline. When enslaved people vanished, neighbors assumed they'd been sold or had run away. New Orleans' rigid social order allowed the powerful to exploit the powerless with little interference, and Delphine thrived in that system. Her elite connections also shielded her. Few wanted to believe someone of her rank could be capable of such things, and when accusations surfaced, they were quickly dismissed. She knew the value of reputation and protected hers carefully, using wealth and generosity as armor. For nearly a decade, this facade allowed her to commit atrocities with almost no risk of discovery. But by the early 1830s, cracks began to show. Whispers circulated and suspicions grew. The first public scandal erupted in 1833, when a young enslaved girl named Leah fell from the mansion's roof to her death. Witnesses said she'd been chased there by Delphine, who was brandishing a whip and shouting threats. What should have been treated as a horrifying tragedy was instead brushed off. Delphine was fined and ordered to sell 9 of her enslaved people, but she simply had relatives buy them and return them to her. Even in the face of death, her status protected her. But the incident left people unsettled, and some neighbors began watching the household more closely. They noticed strange patterns. Enslaved people entered the mansion and never came back out. Those who remained looked malnourished and terrified. Disturbing odors wafted through the upper floors and basement. At night, chilling screams could be heard. When questioned, the LaLaurie's offered neat explanations. Dr. LaLaurie was conducting medical procedures, or discipline was being enforced. Society accepted these excuses because they fit the expectations of the time. But to those who looked closely, it was clear something terrible was happening at 1140 Royal Street. And on April 10, 1834, the truth could no longer be hidden. That morning, an enslaved woman, also named Leah, though not the same girl who had died before, made a desperate choice. Chained to the kitchen stove, she set the mansion on fire, preferring the risk of burning alive to the certainty of further torture. Flames spread rapidly, and neighbors rushed in to help put them out. But strangely, the LaLaurie's resisted the aid, insisting the fire was under control. The smoke pouring from the windows told a different story, and frustrated neighbors forced their way inside. On the ground floor, they found Leah chained to the stove, unable to escape even as fire threatened to consume her. But upstairs, they discovered horrors that would scar them for life. When the attic doors were broken open, rescuers faced a nightmare. 7 enslaved people were chained, mutilated, and deformed from prolonged torture. Spiked iron collars pierced their flesh. Limbs were stretched and torn. Some were missing parts of their bodies. Men and women, young and old, all showed signs of years of systematic torment. Some bore evidence of grotesque medical experiments, skulls drilled, bones broken, and reset into unnatural shapes. The scene was so unbearable that rescuers became physically sick. Word of the discovery spread quickly, and soon an angry mob gathered outside the mansion, demanding justice. Newspapers described the horrors in graphic detail, reporting that enslaved people had been suspended by the neck, with limbs torn from one side to the other. Public outrage boiled into violence as crowds swelled, calling for the LaLaurie's to be handed over. But Delphine LaLaurie was already slipping away. She had allies and loyal servants who helped her escape before the mob could capture her. The furious crowd ransacked the mansion, smashing its elegant contents to pieces, but their real target was already gone. She fled the city, eventually making her way to France. The revelation of what had happened inside her home shocked New Orleans to its core. For the first time, the elite were forced to confront the brutal truth of what unchecked power and cruelty could do. Yet justice was impossible. Enslaved people had no legal protection, and LaLaurie's escape ensured she would never face trial. Investigations afterward uncovered even darker details. The mansion's upper floors and basement had been outfitted as full torture chambers. Instruments and restraints showed years of systematic abuse. Evidence revealed a long history of disappearances, deaths, and experiments carried out with disturbing precision. The involvement of Dr. LaLaurie remained unclear. Some claimed he was complicit. Others believed he was too weak to stop his wife. Complaints and suspicions had circulated for years, but wealth and influence had silenced them. The true number of victims would never be known. Her escape was carefully planned, aided by the same elite connections that had shielded her for years. Some believed she had prepared for flight long before the fire, sensing her crimes were catching up to her. Once in France, her trail went cold. Some claimed she lived quietly in Paris. Others whispered she returned secretly to New Orleans. An epitaph plate discovered in 1873 suggested she may have died in New Orleans, but her final years remain a mystery. Her legacy, however, was fixed, not as the graceful Southern belle she pretended to be, but as one of America's most infamous killers. The mansion itself stood as a grim reminder, passed between owners over the years. It gained a reputation as the most haunted building in New Orleans. The horrors revealed inside challenged the romanticized view of slavery, exposing the extreme cruelty hidden beneath the surface. Abolitionists seized on the case as proof of slavery's inhumanity, while others were forced to confront the failures of a system that allowed such atrocities to flourish. Delphine LaLaurie's crimes were made possible by her wealth, her status, and a society that refused to see enslaved people as human. Her story stands as a chilling reminder that the greatest evils can come not from monsters in the shadows, but from those who walk among us in plain sight, wearing the mask of respectability.